You're listening to episode 24 of the On Being Human podcast.
Welcome to the On Being Human podcast, where we believe transforming ourselves can positively transform society. Your host, Brandy Fleck, has the honor of exploring the human condition with real people who bravely share their personal stories of adversity, healing, joy, and more. If you're seeking empowerment, strength, and inspiration, listen in to engage and explore tough topics that help us humanize one another, understand ourselves better, spread love, and connect.
Welcome back to another soul-exposing exploration of what it means to be human. This week's guest reads about 100 books a year. Not only does she read as part of her career as a literary agent, but she tears through books in her limited spare time, whether it's during her kiddos' bedtime routine or reading nonfiction for fun. It is such a pleasure to introduce you to Holly Root, entrepreneur and owner of Root Literary, based in Los Angeles, California. Holly has launched more than 24 New York Times bestsellers. Holly started out in publishing in Nashville, where she learned that reading rather than editing was closer to what she wanted to do with her life. So she moved to New York to learn the ropes and eventually ended up in LA. Approximately 2 years ago, Holly opened her own agency. She primarily signs authors who write general fiction, middle grade fiction, and science fiction, but really falls in love with an author's voice, regardless of genre. Her agency is always accepting submissions. When Holly isn't growing her business, she spends her time with her children and husband. Today, Holly teaches us about how reading enables us to try on other people's lives, a way of satiating curiosity about the human condition and trying on scenarios that we may not safely be able to experience in our real lives. She essentially says that our minds make sense of the human condition and our experiences through narrative, so that's why fiction narratives are so compelling. Also, you'll definitely want to tune in to hear Holly's opinion on whether or not you should keep reading books you're just not that into. What do you think? Should you? This week's episode takes us further into an On Being Human exploration of the impact that the arts, humanities, food, and education have on our human condition and how we interact with those things to shape our lives. Last week on episode 23, we heard a Nashville author's thoughts on how handmaking enriches our lives and how to make connections through hobbies. That was with Stephanie Stewart Howard. Next week, we'll explore how plant-based diets connect us to our compassion and help the planet with the lovely Denise Brown. And you can find this week's episode with Holly Root at onbeinghumanpodcast.com/episodes/024. Throughout this exploration, I've been asking, what is our nature? In addition to creating, building, and living, it's also seeking fun and joy. What characterizes an experience that is necessary or valuable to our well-being as humans when it's beyond mere survival? This week, we explore why reading is necessary and valuable to our well-being. As you think about these topics, tell me what you're thinking. Starting the conversation is a great first step to enacting change. At onbeinghumanpodcast.com, you can now sign up to join in this conversation with me. Leave your name and email address, and I'll include you in a monthly newsletter. No spam whatsoever. Just updates on what's coming up with the podcast and the conversation that's happening with others in the On Being Human community. It's a chance to interact and have your voice heard here. I'm here to listen and find answers about why we are the way we are and what we can do to enact change for the better. And on that note, I want to thank you so much for listening. This new podcast is growing because you guys are listening, and it's really exciting. I also want to ask you 2 questions. Are you loving what you're hearing at your favorite podcast, On Being Human? And are you going to shop at Amazon this week? To support our efforts, you can now go to onbeinghumanpodcast.com/shop and click the Amazon banner there to do your regular shopping. At no additional charge to you, a portion of all your purchases made through that click will go directly to the production of this podcast. How easy is that? Same Amazon, same experience, same shopping you'd do anyways. But best of all, same prices, but you're supporting the On Being Human podcast. I plan to keep the podcast as a free subscription to valuable content for as long as I'm running it. So that little click from onbeinghumanpodcast.com/shop before you start shopping on Amazon is the difference to help make that happen. As always, subscribe on iTunes and Apple Podcasts, leave a rating, leave a review, and you can find the show's presence on Facebook and Pinterest for now. Without further ado, let's hear from the energetic and brilliant Holly Root. Hi, Holly. Welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
No problem. I'm so excited to have you here today to talk about the human condition in literature. Before we get into who you are and what you do, though, something I ask everyone on the show is, what does being human mean to you?
I view being human, this is maybe a weird take, but as sort of a calling or responsibility.
Okay.
That we are here and we have these amazing connective skills and inclination. Like our first, most basic response is to connect with others. And so to me, being human is about how we live out that connection.
Awesome. Very cool. So we're going to talk about that connection and how we connect to stories in literature. And so our listeners know, you have launched dozens of books as New York Times bestsellers, and you own Root Literary, which is an agency in LA. So definitely you have some insight into what makes us tick in terms of connection and relating to stories. So what are your thoughts on that, and what do people relate to in literature?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think much like it's sort of that primal drive, right?
Mm-hmm.
Between connecting, sort of the next thing we do is we narrativize. I have little kids, and so it's been really cool to sort of watch how their story-making brains work, and to just see sort of that pure, unfiltered need to create story and architecture around the events of our lives. Our brains are so fascinating, the way that they want to find these structures and these connections between what would otherwise just be a random assortment of events, and the way that we learn is so much based in story. So I think that it's a really primal thing. I mean, it's funny to think about, honestly, because in my day-to-day, I'm thinking about, like, who do I think would read this? How do I reach those people? Just to give your readers a little bit of a context, because literary agent is a weird job. I work with writers to sell their books to publishers and then continue to work with them after the point of sale to sort of shape their careers and manage their professional lives. So it's funny because so much of our day to day is this, like, very nuts and bolts of, like, how are the books going to get there? And did we meet the deadline and that kind of thing? So it's good to sort of tap into the more pure human essential reasons that we tell stories.
Yeah. Awesome. So I'm glad that you explained what you do as a literary agent, because I wanted to dive into a little bit of a statement you made on a wish list that you have online. It's about the types of work you respond to and like to represent. And in it you say, I find the interplay of human relationships, when well done, every bit as potent a story driver as espionage. So can you dive a little deeper into that? And what is it about human relationships that suck you into a story?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those sort of essential humanity things, I think. Like, we're all, we're hardwired for gossip, for example.
Sure.
As much as it's not necessarily something that you want to indulge in too often, we have this real curiosity about what it's like to be in situations other than our own and relationships other than our own. And I think that the quote that you read was talking about a very specific sort of like subset of fiction, domestic suspense, which, if you've ever read, Leanne Moriarty or Gillian Flynn, then you've read domestic suspense. And those are two really different kinds of books, right? Like, if you've ever read those two authors, they're really different in terms of the amounts of violence, in terms of the style of the prose. And what I was going for in saying that was sort of helping people understand where on the spectrum I fall. That for me, one of the things that is really page turning is figuring out how people tick and why, and what their relationships are like, and how they are acting in connection to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that both of those authors do that beautifully. But it's that is the real appeal for me, rather than sort of how twisty-turny is the plot. So that's sort of where that directive came from. But I think it just goes back to the fact that reading lets us live in lives and brains that are not our own. And that's one of the things that keeps me coming back to stories, to fiction, to TV, to all the different kinds of narrative in our lives over and over again.
Sure. Man, I really love that. That's a great perspective. And I hadn't thought about it like that before. So definitely some food for thought there. So you talk about, you prefer the interplay of relationships over maybe a twisty, turny plot. So my next question was going to be, why must a story have conflict to keep moving? But I probably want to specify that conflict doesn't necessarily have to be like huge, crazy plot twists or something like that, but any kind of conflict. And why are we as humans drawn to conflict in stories?
Well, I think it's one of the things that is most powerful about stories is that it lets us work out situations that we might face in the future, have faced in our pasts. It gives us a place, a playground to sort of work through those and imagine ourselves in that position of that character. And so, a great example of this, I just read a book, it just came out, called My Lovely Wife, which is a world that I would absolutely not want to live in as a human. The premise is that it's this very sort of typical presenting picture perfect suburban couple, but to keep their marriage fresh, they've taken to murdering people together, which is not a life choice that I've ever want to participate in. But one of the things that was so amazing about that book, which is very plotty, very twisty, but it's really driven by the psychology of the characters.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I didn't like these people at all, not put it down, because even as I felt sort of sick to my stomach, I just had to know why they were doing this, what made them tick, because it was something that is so not a world I ever want to even like come near to. Like,
sure.
I don't even want to live in their neighborhood. But it was fascinating. And I think that opportunity to step outside of ourselves in a psychologically safe and appropriate fashion is one of the biggest and best gifts that story gives us.
That is a really great point. And yes, like just step outside of ourselves. This insatiable curiosity is really cool to think about. So I almost feel like maybe we're going to touch on the same type of answer here, but what is it about a fictional character's journey that appeals to our journeys? There might be a subtle difference, because at times some fictional characters can seem like caricatures of reality, and at other times it seems like real life can even be stranger than fiction, almost too outlandish to be believable in fiction. So what is really at the root of how we connect to a fictional character?
So this is such a good and interesting question, and something I think about all the time, because there is no one fixed answer to it. There are so many different kinds of writers out there and so many different kinds of characters. And one thing that I have observed is that there are as many different reasons that characters connect with people as there are readers. And one of the things that I talk about a lot in my work life with my authors is that, the author is without being aware of it, because once the author's work is done, they walk away, in conversation with a reader. Like every book is not fully done until a reader comes to it. Okay. And what the reader brings to it is going to be different from person to person. So, there are some characters that I have read and thought, okay. And like the book just didn't necessarily click for me. And another reader comes to that and says, I feel so seen. Like that is, I fell right in, like that, the way that character talked about this particular aspect of life just resonated for me. And I fell right in and felt like I was that character. So I think for part of the magic of connection is that it is individualized, and that there is no one right way to read a book or to meet a character, and that books are there for you at different times in your life as you become different people. There have been books that I've read and thought, and dropped them, and then come back 2 years later and thought, well, maybe I will check that one off the list, and fallen right in immediately and been totally sucked up. So as much as it's about the character, I find it's often about the reader.
Awesome. So you touched on something there that maybe we should talk about a little bit, which is how our identity changes over the course of our life. Do you find, well, just tell me a little bit more about that. in your own experience. What do you think about identity?
Especially as it interfaces with books, it's such a big piece of it that you can't really know. There's always a reader out there for every book. And this, in my professional life, so when I'm thinking about, taking something on as a new client, usually how that process works for me is someone will have sent an email. We're pretty much open for submissions all the time. Someone will have sent an email pitching a book, and I will have requested to read the book, and I read the book and decide if I have the right vision for sort of how to help that author launch it into the world. And all the time we talk about the kismet that this entire business runs on, because there are absolutely books that have gone on to wide acclaim that I had in on submission and either didn't know what to do with, or was like, yeah, that's a thing, but I don't need to be the person who's on its team, or just totally missed, like it didn't spark to me for whatever reason. And the only way that reality can keep you from going absolutely batty, because the book publishing is a really small industry. We all kind of know that within the realm of agents, like most people are known to me by name and reputation, if not personally. But a lot of them are actually good friends. So we know each other pretty well, and we know kind of what other people are up to. And the only way that the fact that you just can't have everything is okay is by really accepting and coming to this very almost Zen place of like, books end up where they are meant to be.
Sure.
And I think that has a lot to do with your own identity and your own sense of yourself. And then frankly, I think that the same is true for readers, that books find readers at the right place and time. And that's why sometimes when I talk with friends who aren't in the business and they're like, oh yeah, I just like keep trying to read that. I'm like, let it go. Don't force, like, life is too short. There are so many books, like, let it go. And if it is meant for you later, you will come back to it. And, maybe you never come back to it, but maybe it really is the kind of thing. One of my very favorite books was this book called Codename Verity, which is a World War II historical young adult novel. And it is an extraordinary friendship story. It is so beautiful. And the first couple times I picked it up, I just couldn't quite get into the right headspace for it. And again, it was me, not the book. The book is beautiful. And I just set it aside. And when I came back to it, it was at a point where I think I had not been paying a ton of attention to my friendships. It was just, I didn't have a lot of bandwidth for it at that point in time. And reading that book really encouraged me to reach back out and make a point of reconnecting with some people that I felt like I could stand to see more. And so, it's just a little example of the way that I think books find you at the exact right moment.
Very cool. Very cool. And I love how you mentioned that, people trying to read books and you say, they just can't get into it. And you're like, put it down. I've been through that so many times. I can't tell you like how many great books are just on my to read list, and I have just had to put them down. So I think lots of people can relate to that.
Oh, I'm a huge advocate for quitting books. Like, life is too short to read something you don't like, even if it's supposed to be like the best thing ever. Quit it, man. Move on. Find something you love.
That's good to hear. Yeah. So do you think that what people learn from fiction can be applied in our daily lives? And what are some examples of that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't know if this is just because I'm a grade A book nerd or if this is something everybody does, but books that I really love, I find myself thinking about the characters, like wondering what they're up to later after the fact. Obviously more easily done with contemporary fiction. But yeah, I think about people and situations from books all the time. And, watching people, again, like I said about the idea of fiction as playground, I think watching other people go through things can help you in your own life and situations and circumstances. And I always think of it as like, especially if you're reading a book, about train wreck families or whatever, like, oh, I'm so glad that I read this so I didn't have to go make those mistakes myself. So I am a big believer in applying those truths that are illuminated from fiction into our own lives.
Wonderful. So I want to dive into the literary technique of voice for a minute. And can you tell us, what is voice in a book? And does it in any way connect with our ability as humans to have a voice and to be heard outside of a book?
Yeah, so I love that question. I find that voice is, I tend to work with my authors for a really long time, like over many books and many years. And so I find that the reason that that is the case is because what I respond to as a reader is so often voice. So I will follow that person. Like it doesn't matter if they, I signed them for, I have an example literally on my list of an author I signed for a middle grade novel, and then we have since sold like 40 romance novels. Like that doesn't make sense. Middle grade is fiction for like roughly 8 to 12-year-olds.
Okay.
So that's what I read from her, and then what we ended up doing was not that. But the fact that I loved her then and I loved her in another genre, like it is about voice. And I think that voice is highly individualized. It's the thing that, I was, this has been years ago now, but I was getting caught up on reading, and I read a lot of my submissions and my clients' works in progress on a Kindle because you can just email files to yourself and it's nice to have on the go. Much more pleasant than reading on a computer screen. And so I opened up my Kindle, and for whatever reason, I hadn't like changed the file names on anything. So it was just a whole bunch of like, WIP 12 to, final or whatever. It's like gobbledygook file names that didn't indicate from whom they were sent. So I opened up this one and was like, oh my gosh, I love this. Oh, this is so good. And then I turned the page and was like, oh, of course it's good. It's, my client. And I knew immediately who it was, and then went back and checked and was like, yep, that was it. And I think that really is the purest distillation of voice, that I could open up a file on a Kindle with no identifying information and be like, oh, that's who that is. And I think voice does carry over. It can be changed and it can be shaped and it can be stylized. And it also changes as a person and a writer grows and matures and just has a different lived experience. So voices can change over time, and particularly working within different genres have different expectations. And so somebody's middle grade novel won't sound exactly like their romance novel, but you could tell that they were the same person. So, if you have a favorite author who, like Stephen King, writes across a bunch of genres, you kind of can always hear the essential Stephen Kingness within that, whether it's super scary or more emotional or very fast paced or a little bit more lyrical. There's an underlying drumbeat that is that authorial voice. And I think that is a really pure distillation of someone's essence, is how they write and how they communicate. And that's their emissary to their readership and their point of connection to that wider world.
Wow, I really like that explanation. So that takes me to my next question, which is, do you think that authors can have several voices, even if that's their essence? Like, is it possible for them to make up a voice that's not necessarily true to who they are, but is useful for entertainment? Or is that the kind of thing that doesn't work because it's not genuine?
I mean, I think it's very hard to do. There are some people who do have that skill set, like in particular, people who are really good ghostwriters. But for them, I think it's almost more like an actor slipping into a role, like they are inhabiting and sort of channeling the person for whom they are writing. And that's a really specific and very valuable skill set. But I think for most fiction writers, voice is something you can refine and shape. Like you can, like I said, if you're working in different genres, you're meeting different reader expectations. Everything's not going to sound exactly the same. But I think that there is a sort of pureness to, once you tap into your own voice and identify it, that you don't want to mess with too much. So the things that you're changing are more technical. Like you could change up how you could improve your actual like literal writing craft, but voice tends to shine through regardless. And sometimes people's voices just aren't good fits for things, or, there'll be a sort of wave. I'm thinking right now, there was a point like around the like 2008 through 2010 when like blogging and internet writing was really big. Maybe even earlier than that, like maybe the early aughts too.
Mm-hmm.
And everything sort of had this like, there was this very sort of forced conversational like voicey was the word that got said in the industry a lot. Like, it's so voicey, but now it's aged really badly. And you can look back and see the people on whom it felt really natural. And then the people where you're like, oh, you were trying to sound like a moment, but where your work has gone since then sounds more genuine. So I think people can do it, but I think a lot of times it doesn't result in people's very best work, so much as sort of writing the book the way that only they could write it results in a more interesting and long-lasting product.
Gotcha. So to shift a little bit, where is the line between entertainment and the enrichment of our minds? Or is there a line?
I would argue that within the book world, I am not here for gatekeeping people's joy. Like, sometimes people will say to me, I mean, I work in really commercial fiction. So like, my goal is not to, like, if I represent the great American novel, it will be like, oh, whoops, that happened. Not like, I'm trying to do things that matter to a lot of people, that
Sure.
a lot of people can connect with. Like, and I that's a little reductive. Like, ideally, the great American novel also does that. But my goal is not to do the, like, neglected literary, like, experimental thing that might, make a very big splash in an academic pond. My goal is to do the things that you could buy at Target.
Mm-hmm.
So, caveat, like, I am not some fancy pants, but sometimes people will say, like, oh, I just read, like, comic books. And I'm like, that's reading, dude. Like, don't feel bad. Like, that's not something you need to say, oh, I just ... I am not here for apologizing for anything that brings you joy.
Mm-hmm.
I think that reading is spectacular for people's brains. And if you are doing it at all, then, like, good for you. Sometimes people too will be like, oh, I only read ebooks. Like, that's somehow, or like, I only read audiobooks. And I'm like, yeah, dude, all still reading.
Uh-huh.
Like, it counts. It totally counts. So to me, I actually don't think that there is a point where you need to differentiate between the two. I do think there's value in pushing yourself sometimes out of your comfort zone. Like, my own personal reading, I tend to read a lot of nonfiction because I don't do as much of it professionally. So it's easier for me to switch off the part of my brain that's in work mode.
Sure.
And just enjoy. I'm also a really curious person, and I find that nonfiction scratches that itch in a way that sometimes fiction doesn't. So I'm a big believer in pushing boundaries for yourself and setting yourself, some challenges, trying to read a different, broaden your reach in what you are reading. But that's more like for funsies for yourself, not like a scoldy, the only right way to do it is X. I am not here for gatekeeping people's fun.
Great. That's awesome answer. Thank you. That's good. So I know you read a ton. You do it for a living, and you just said you read in your spare time. So what has reading so much taught you about the human condition?
I learn so much all the time from books, from reading, because it's you're getting to climb inside someone's brain for a little bit, and all the better if that brain is not exactly like yours. So both in reading books from people who have very different backgrounds from mine, from people who've had different socioeconomic or racial or geographical experiences, that is an opportunity to walk around in a set of shoes that I've not gotten to try on before. I think there's so much to be learned, and it's an intimacy and an access that is so generous on behalf of the creators. Like, the fact that you can just go wander around in these stories that somebody has given you, whether they're, a memoir or a novel, is so intimate. And I'm so grateful that I've gotten to do that. And then, like I said, my other sort of like love, just as a reader myself, is I love science nonfiction. So if you want to know anything about like marine mammals, I am your girl. I have read every book about marine mammals available. There are not enough for me. Like, I would literally do nothing but read about whales all the time if I could.
That's awesome.
So I have like learned a lot, both about being human. Although, frankly, I would argue humans are kind of the worst species, is what reading so many books about marine mammals has taught me.
Oh,
I welcome, like, listen, if the whales take over, I will serve them and I will oppress my fellow humans in service of the whales.
oh
So
no. Yeah.
I don't know if that's the right takeaway for the podcast on being human, but listen, if you want to join me in service to our whale overlords, I'm available.
That's awesome. Oh gosh. Like, oh, I know that we don't necessarily treat the whales very nicely as a human race. So
We're not great.
Yeah.
We're not great.
You have a point.
It would be justified if they oppressed us.
Yeah, I think it would, honestly. Did you see the picture of the black hole? What did you think about that?
Oh, I was very into the black hole and also the backstory of it.
Yeah.
Female scientist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Amazing.
She's been working on it for 3 years. That was pretty cool.
That was a very positive. That was a nice cleansing of my Twitter timeline as everyone came together in joy about the accomplishment that represented.
Yes. So, real quick, how many books a week or a month do you read?
It depends on what they are. I mean, and also like what the timeline is. So obviously, if I have a client book that I need to read like real quick because the client's, concerned about it or on deadline or whatever, then that takes priority. I'm looking at my whiteboard here. I think thankfully, these are not all my books, but I usually have between 30 and 40 books a year published from my clients. So that, start there. And then new submissions, both for me and then for my colleagues here at the agency, if I'm doing like a supportive read, if they wanted to, get another opinion about whether a manuscript is something they should pursue. And those aren't all, it's hard to sort of categorize because you don't read all of everything. Once you know that something's not for you, it's like, again, this is why it's so easy for me to be like, just quit. Because if I didn't, I would literally never get through the amount of stuff that I have to engage with in a given year.
Sure.
But so, I don't read every single page of every single submission that comes in, not because they're not good. There's a lot of reasons I would say no that didn't have any reflection at all on the quality of the material. And then personally, I track my reading because the best way to sort of keep up with something is to watch it. And my goal every year is to do 50 books that have nothing to do with like my personal client list or submissions reading. So just published work that isn't for my isn't making me money in any specific way. Because the thing I find, it's important for me on a research standpoint to be current with what is working in the industry, and also to read books from people that I'd like to sell books to. And then also just to remember why I like to do it, because it is when you make your hobby your job, you then take away like one of the unfettered joys in your life. And so finding ways to stay tapped into like, oh yes, I do like to do this. It's not just a bunch of stuff making me feel behind. It's like also a joy and a pleasure. And this year, so like I said, I try to do 50, and I am on like a crazy tear this year. Some of it is just that I've read like nothing but great books that I like powered right through. But also I have gotten really far down the audiobook rabbit hole, and it has like bumped up my number of books so dramatically. And I was never an audio person. I still can't do fiction on audio, can only do nonfiction. But again, like I said, I prefer to read nonfiction for fun. So it actually works out really well.
Awesome.
Yeah. So that's not really an answer to your question, but it's a lot.
It's a lot. Yeah, for sure. And I mean, gosh, I feel like I'm such a slow reader. I don't know how I could even get through the amount of books that you read on a regular basis. That's astronomical, it seems like.
I mean, most people in this business are really fast readers. My husband is just like the more he enjoys something, the slower he goes. He's a savorer, and it makes me crazy. And It's very hard for me to not like try to manage his fun and be like, just there's so many books in the world. Come on, now you're going to spend 6 months. And he's like, I just love living in this world. And like, the more I enjoy it, the slower I go. And I'm like, you're killing me. I can't.
That's so funny. And it's true. Like, I will have been reading and the world is so vivid and so amazing. I don't want to leave it. And when the book is finally over, I almost mourn the loss of that world. It's crazy.
Yep.
Yeah. So Why did you become a literary agent, and what made you decide to open your own agency?
So I worked my first, my first jobs out of college were at publishing houses. And working in Christian publishing, I grew up in Tennessee, and so that was the publishing that was nearest to me geographically. And being inside a house, I figured out what I was good at and what I was not very good at. And then I also had access to things like Publishers Weekly. And from those resources, pieced together that the thing of this that seemed to have the most of the things that I was good at and the fewest of the things I was bad at was actually being an agent, not being an editor. I always thought it was editorial because that's, I didn't even know that this was a job when I was in college.
Mm-hmm.
Admittedly, this was like the dark ages when the internet was not the landscape it is now, but I just had no idea that that was even a thing. And so once I got in-house and had those like early editorial jobs, I realized, oh wait, this is close but not quite right. And then moved to New York and hopped the fence then and became an assistant at an agency, which is how you that's the very classic track for learning the business. It's a real like apprenticeship kind of job because you kind of have to see it in action to understand what all the moving parts are and how you do it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was an assistant for like 3 years, and sort of worked my way up to varying jobs within the company, and then moved over and was just an agent full time. And then that company where I became an agent full time with no other jobs, I was there for 10 years. It was a really good fit, and it's where I did the bulk of my, list building and learning and stretching my wings. And then in the middle of that, I'd moved out to LA. And it just felt like the right next step. I'm really lucky. I worked with people I respect and still do. And, it was all the best way I could think of to describe it as like a graduation, that it was just time to do the next thing. Some of the things that I was excited about involved building something bigger and replicating some of what I had done for my clients that had worked for them, and having a team of people that could do similarly. And the agency I was at before repped really different kinds of books than I did. So it wasn't like I was being a bad team player, like didn't want to share. It was that, different kinds of authors benefit from different kinds of services. So some of the things that we are building and doing for our clients here just wouldn't have been value adds. So it's been really fun to sort of think about those things. And you kind of either are interested in that aspect of it, the entrepreneurship and the business ownership, or you're not. And having done it now, I'm really wishing that I had been someone who was not, because it was very hard to do all that and also like do my more than full-time job. But we did it, and here we are, and I don't have any regrets. But yes, it was a big lift.
Yeah. Well, that's an amazing accomplishment. So just congratulations. And I'm so glad that you're doing what you do. And on a personal note, can you just tell us a little bit about who you are as a person outside of work, and what's your life like, and what's your story, Holly?
Yeah, so I have 2 kids who are almost 6 and 3, and I have a husband who's an actor, and we live in Los Angeles. We lived in New York before. I grew up in Tennessee, so those are sort of like the big data points. And yeah, I mean, it's a funny. I was at a party when my oldest was very small. And this person at this party was like, "So what do you do for fun?" And I just stared blankly at him and then said, I have an 18-month-old. And like, there was nothing else that I could say.
Yeah.
Because, phases of life, man. So
Exactly.
And I feel like my equivalent now is I'm like, my company's not yet 2. So it has been a very intense time of like work focus and just having to sort of double down and wear a lot of hats. But I feel like every month we come out of that further and further, and we've accomplished more of the sort of like big picture projects. And so I'm able to think more about like, what do I enjoy doing? So I like got back into like doing Pilates. It was like, oh, moving my body feels nice.
Yeah.
Like the sort of self-care things that fall by the wayside. I mean, right now I am in sort of a phase where so much of my existence is this treadmill of like work and kids and work and kids and work and kids. And it's the dark side of doing what you love is that like there's the meme of like do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life. And then the counterpoint is do what you love and you'll literally never stop working.
Yeah.
Like that is definitely true. But I love where we live. I love that we are in an outdoor culture, that we can be outside all the time, pretty much year round. I am solar powered. I think that's my Southern coming out, that when we lived in New York, I had a really hard time with the long winters, and I love being in Southern California and not having that. When I can sneak it in, I'm a big theater and film person. We love to see shows. I go back to New York a lot, so I'm usually like when I'm able, I sneak in a Broadway show or two. That's what my husband did when we lived in New York, and so it feels like homecoming in a really fun way. So yeah, those are kind of my usuals.
Awesome. You said you had a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old?
Yeah, almost 6. Yeah.
Do you read them tons of stories?
Oh, our bedtime routine is so out of control. It is absurd. When we talk to people, they're like, no, we do like one story and one song. My kids this is what happens when your mom is a literary agent and your dad's an actor. I mean, first off, my children give me line readings where they're like, Daddy does better voices for this, and you're supposed to say it like that. And I'm like, listen, Daddy is a paid professional. You get what you get and you don't get upset. But they also, I mean, it is so over the top. It's embarrassing. This is our one area in which we like have bad boundaries, but they will, I mean, my big kid now is starting to get into chapter books. So he will read like a whole like bad guys book or Princess in Black, like a whole one. Cause I'm a sucker. Cause I'll get to a breaking point and be like, okay, that's all for tonight. And he's like, but Mama, I have to know what happens. And I'm like, oh, so we'll read like a whole one of those, 2 picture books. Then he's like, can you tell me a story that you make up? And it's like, oh, sure. And then like an hour later, I'm still in there like singing him original musical tunes. And it's just over the top. So yes, we read so much with the boys. And both of our boys are huge fans of books. The big one is just stepping into his own like reader life. Like he just has figured out reading, and he's finishing up kindergarten right now, and it's really cool to watch him spark to encountering stories on his own without sort of the intermediary of a parent reading it to him.
Yeah. Well, that's all really great to hear. Where can listeners find you?
So I am all over the internet. Our company Instagram is @RootLiterary, and we post all about like all the books we've got coming up. So if you're in the market for a great read, especially if you like romance, women's fiction, young adult, middle grade, picture books, you are welcome to join us there. I am on Twitter @HRoot. The agency is also on Twitter @RootLiterary. And that's mostly where we hang out.
Well, Holly, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and some of your personal story with us today. Had a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was great to hang out.
You guys, isn't Holly just so awesome? For all the cool stuff she mentions in the episode and links, go to onbeinghumanpodcast.com/episodes/024. Be sure to leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts so others like yourselves can find the show. And what's your story? Tell me what value you think reading has in our lives and how it adds to our well-being over at facebook.com/onbeinghumanpodcast. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Tune in weekly at onbeinghumanpodcast.com for more soul-exposing explorations of what it means to be human. Until next week, love to you all.